because they changed the constitution, they had for the first time under Ba'ath rule, since the Ba'ath revolution, a multi-candidate election, and Bashar al-Assad won. I mean, they forget that part. It's like, yeah, there was a multi-candidate election, but like Assad won.
Mira que ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, viva la revolución.
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
The Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party was founded by Michel Aflaq and several others in 1947. And the name Ba'ath means renaissance or resurrection. And it is a combination, it's a synthesis of Arab nationalism, pan-Arabism, Arab socialism, anti-imperialism, and many other things. And Ba'athism, in a way, can be compared to Bolivarianism in Latin America, which calls for the unification of the Arab world into a single state or a single entity that cooperates and trades with each other, one people, because the Arab people are one people, even though we have these artificial borders that were designed by the imperialists in the First and Second World Wars. The motto of the Ba'ath Party is unity, liberty, socialism. And in a way, this was a resistance to Zionism. We have to remember that the state of Israel was founded in 1948 by the imperialists, by Theodore Herzl, his ideas, and all these wealthy billionaires, and after the Balfour Declaration in the early 1900s. So in a way, Baathism and Arab nationalism was in response to this rising threat of Zionism, which was a beachhead for imperialism and neocolonialism in the region. And Syria has been one of the countries at the forefront for many years. The Assad family maintaining Baathism in Syria, and Assad in particular has been targeted by a lot of Western imperialist maneuvers and operations, false flag attacks, media slanders. We all remember 2013, 2014, when it felt like we were on the brink of war with Syria and invading Syria, and all of this that proved to be nonsense. So what I'm going to do is I want to play a clip. This is, again, right, we're going to be debunking some of the common propaganda talking points about the different legs of the axis of resistance. And this video is called How Bashar al-Assad Destroyed Syria by Now This World 2015. Again, keep in mind that Assad has one of the highest approval ratings of most presidents in the world. The Syrian people love him, and of all backgrounds, not just Shia, Islam, Sunni, Christians, everybody. So I'm going to play this clip, and then we'll talk to Jay about what is actually, to give us a rundown of what actually Baathism represents in Syria and how it's different from the mainstream media propaganda.
As Syria struggles through an ongoing civil war and the terrorist group ISIS spreads through the region, there seems to be one person being blamed for the significant decline of the Middle Eastern country: Bashar al-Assad. So is Assad destroying Syria? Well, Syria was already suffering from a dynastic authoritarian regime since Assad's father seized power in the 1970s in a coup d'etat. When Bashar took over as the nepotistic ruler of Syria in 2000, he continued his father's repressive regime. He instigated severe crackdowns on any political dissent, private or public. The resulting backlash forced him to release a number of political prisoners to ease tensions. But it didn't work. By 2011, when much of the Arab world was revolting during the Arab Spring, Assad authorized the release of a significant number of terrorist leaders from prison. These terrorists would soon after regroup to form ISIS. This, coupled with violent crackdowns on protesters, turned the Arab Spring into an armed rebellion by the Syrian opposition, pitting the Sunni Muslim majority against Assad's Alawite Shia minority. As the civil war progressed, Assad continued arresting citizens and was personally implicated in a number of war crimes by the UN, including the imprisonment and killing of his own citizens. By 2015, some 200,000 political prisoners alone had been jailed for speaking out against the regime. Although most of the Arab League, along with the US and EU, have demanded that Assad step down as president, he instead ran for a third term in 2014. His victory was widely considered illegitimate and the votes faked or coerced. Recent reports suggest that Assad has been assisting ISIS militarily in their spread across Syria. In the meantime, Assad's actions have forced 6.5 million residents out of their homes and 3 million out of the country, as well as decimating the economy and military. Reports say that Syria would not return to pre-civil war conditions for another 30 years at least, following the end of the conflict. In short, Bashar al-Assad is not only destroying Syria, but essentially helped facilitate the formation and rise of ISIS. To learn about where they're going, check out our video.
9.5 million Syrians have been forced to flee their homes. Over 3 million of those have fled the country.
There's a link to that video in the description below. Thanks so much for watching TestTube News.
I like how they put music that you would use for a video, like an Etsy video, like how to make pancakes. So it's like, like the piano. And then they have some like disgusting imperialist lies about Syria. They blame Assad basically for creating ISIS. Can you believe that? They say that the guy who's responsible for fighting and leading the fight against Daesh ISIS is the person responsible for creating them. And they also blame the exodus of migrants from Syria on Assad. Jay, tell us what's really going on and the significance of Baathism in Syria and why it's important for communists to defend Syria.
Well, thank you for ruining my morning by making me have to watch that. But, look, if we're going to respond to that point by point, I jotted down a few things, and after that, we'll talk about Baathism. They said that Syria was suffering from a dynastic authoritarian regime. Now, authoritarian as it might be, you cannot be a resistant state and a liberal democracy at the same time when you have Israel to one side, Turkey to the other side, and they're both breathing down your neck, and the United States has designated your country as part of the axis of evil since 2003. You simply cannot be a liberal democracy. That's number one. Secondly, it may have been dynastic and authoritarian, but let's not forget that despite Syria having a per capita income of around $2,000 to $3,000, in terms of life expectancy, education, healthcare, rights for women, Syria was right up there in the Arab world, despite not having all of the privileges of being a protectorate like Qatar. It had many of the same living standards as Qatar. And let's not forget that Qatar is basically like a slave state, like the majority of the population are immigrants from countries like South Asia, or countries in South Asia, rather. So that's the second point. You mentioned the releasing of prisoners, right? I mean, well, the irony in that very video is that they said that in the beginning, the protests called for the releasing of political prisoners. And then they say Assad is responsible for releasing prisoners who then turned into ISIS. Now, I've actually done some research on this, and there were about 6 or 7. I can't remember the names now. I mean, if you had asked me about 3 or 4 years ago, I'd be able to rattle them off the top of my head. But there were about 6 or 7 people that were released in those prisoner exchanges back in 2011. And the majority of them, 5 of them, ended up joining the so-called moderate groups, like Ahrar al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam. Only like 1 or 2 ended up joining Islamic State. But the thing is, that's what the protesters were demanding. That's what the West was demanding. That's what the Muslim Brotherhood was demanding. The Saudis, like every country that was against Syria, the NATO, GCC axis was demanding that that Syria release these prisoners, and then some of them ended up joining the insurgency against the Syrian government. I mean, they also mentioned that the UN and the EU demanded that Assad step down. I mean, I don't think that's true for the UN. Like, I think that's a prevarication, because the UN really, it's not there. Because, like, if anything, from memory, I think they were pushing for dialogue and things like that, right? I mean, for like reform and getting the different parties together to be like a kind of arbitrator. But then, the EU, I mean, who are they to demand that Assad steps down? That's for the Syrian people to decide. They mentioned that Assad's actions in forcing 6 million refugees to leave. What about the economic sanctions on Syria? Like,
Right.
The economic sanctions on Syria are causing food prices to go up. They're causing a lack of medicines. Obviously, under those conditions, people are going to leave. And the EU has been playing the cynical game where they want the Syrian state to collapse. And so they open their borders to refugees from Syria. And so, these these people in Syria are faced with a choice. Do they stay in Syria, possibly get conscripted into the Syrian army to fight against ISIS? Or do they leave to greener pastures in Europe? And you know, the Israelis have been facilitating this. A lot of Israeli NGOs have been behind this this pressure campaign on the EU to let in these refugees. A lot of right wingers say it. They're not wrong. And finally, the rise of ISIS. I mean, you're ignoring the elephant in the room, which is that you know, Saudi Arabia has been the major funder of Islamic State. There's just so much evidence that Turkey has been funding them as well. The arms shipments that came from Libya to Turkey that was sent there by the CIA and MI6 ended up in the hands of the Turkish government, which then gave it to anyone who was willing to fight the Syrian government. Once these people crossed the borders into Syria with their arms, they were free to join whatever militia they liked. And Islamic State was the group that was the most organized on the ground, because after 2013, 2014, they had seized control of all the oil fields in northern Syria. I mean, that's because of the weakness of the Syrian state, and it's the NATO GCC Israeli axis that's contributed to destabilizing and weakening the Syrian state. And so they're the ones that are responsible for the rise of ISIS, not the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Did you want me to go into...
Yeah, so that's such a great rundown. And before you do, what I want to do is I just want to share an image that I saw. This image really put things in perspective for me. You know, they say Assad is not in any way popular. The people, he's unliked, and he has no rule. And this image that we're looking at, for those of you listening, there's literally like millions of people out in the streets of Damascus, which is the oldest inhabited city in the world, by the way. A beautiful city I'd love to go to one day. At an Assad rally, millions of people. You can't tell me that all these people are paid or were forced to go there. You know, who's gonna be the person that's putting them at gunpoint? How much money are they going to be paying people for that? And I think these images, you're never going to see that in mainstream media, and it just represents the popularity of Assad. And I think another thing that I wanted to share as well is also his international solidarity. This is an image of the late Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez with President Bashar al-Assad that says, "Welcome to Venezuela, President of the Arab Republic of Syria, Bashar al-Assad." Hugo Chavez is somebody who firmly stood with President Assad and the Syrian people against empire. And I'm glad you did that, Comrade Jay. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the roots and origins of Baathism as well, and why it's something that communists and leftists should support now, historically and in the present.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the Baathists, they have their roots in the peasantry and in the working class. And so whenever people say that Syria is a dictatorship, I mean, they're not wrong insofar as, you know, the Baath Party historically did have a political monopoly over the constitution. But all of that changed in 2012. Because previously the way that it worked is that if you were an alternative political party, you needed to have the permission of the Baath Party, or you could be an independent. You know, other than that, what people forget is that according to the Syrian constitution, 50% of the seats in parliament are reserved for workers and farmers. You know, so this is something you don't see in the United States. You know, you don't see these provisions. After 2012, they eliminated the formal political monopoly that the Baath Party had. So now Syria is technically just another liberal democracy. Okay, it's not liberal. I mean, it's still authoritarian, but like you can have authoritarian measures enacted by a democracy because the population feels that it's necessary to counter an external threat. But simply because a country is authoritarian doesn't mean it's not a democracy. So Syria has actually become like a pluralistic democracy from 2012 onwards in ways that it wasn't before. In the past, the way that it operated is that the Baath Party would select its own internal candidate for the president of the country, and that president would run unopposed in a plebiscite. And so people would be able to vote yes or no. You know, do you want Hafez al-Assad to continue being the president, yes or no? So in 2014, I mean, they showed this in that clip. Because they changed the constitution, they had for the first time under Baath rule, since the Baath revolution, a multi-candidate election, and Bashar al-Assad won. I mean, they forget that part. You know, it's like, yeah, there was a multi-candidate election, but like Assad won. You know, and that's because, you know, during times of war, most countries are not keen on changing the leader. That's like a normal thing everywhere.
I think that's a great analysis, because a lot of times people equate a quote unquote liberal democracy with having a new leader every 4 years. And in my home country of Honduras, where the people are living in complete impoverishment, there has been crime, murder. It's extremely colonized, oppressed nation, one of the poorest in the Western Hemisphere. We've had presidents every 4 years. It's a revolving door of leaders who come in and out. And people around the world prefer stability. It's like I compare it to a flight. If you're taking a long flight, let's say I'm going to visit you, you're in Australia, I'm in Los Angeles and Cali. That's a pretty long flight, right? If that flight had like 5 different pilots rotating every hour, I'd be kind of, a little concerned. But if we had one good pilot who knew what the hell they were doing for the whole flight, I'm cool with that, because what I want is stability. I want that flight to be as smooth as possible without any bumps. And I think that's what people in the West fail to understand, that in many of these countries, like you said, where they're not allowed to even have stability and peace. Like, stability and peace is impossible when you're surrounded by all these imperialist forces that are undermining and destabilizing your nation. The people want peace and stability, and that's what Assad has been able to deliver. And I think the Western liberal, the cafe latte socialists are just unable to understand that. They just see a strong man, they see a strong leader, and they're like so adverse to that, and it's so interesting.